live in a world where we get constantly bombarded with perspectives, teachings and points of view. What to believe, who to listen to. Here, I will provide some alternative perspectives. Here, you are encouraged to check for yourself, form your own informed opinions and make up your own mind. From the spiritual to the mundane, join me every week as I dive into some of the biggest and smallest issues facing us all. Hello and welcome to the vodcast of Laird Joy. So I'm looking at a blog post I wrote not long ago, and it's called Truth Lost. And just looking at the first paragraph here, you'll find it on my website, johnzorco.com, and have a look after this podcast if you like. So it says, if someone had told me 30 years ago that someday I would find out that everything I think I know is wrong, I would have laughed and said, yeah, sure thing, but I doubt it. And by the way, I now think that it is quite probable that most of the things we think we know that we take for granted as true are probably, at least to some degree, false. So I will let you, wander over to my website if you like and read the rest of that. But just one or two thoughts from me for this podcast episode, just in light of the last the first two episodes, proper episodes of this new vodcast that I am doing. Anyway, so one was about polarity, and and a message, and the message there was to, don't be hating on people just because you disagree with them, because this is such a polarized world now. This kind of led me in a sense to want to do a post about where some of those influences come from that results in so much hate and division in the world. And I was looking at that post, about this blog post, which is really about the influence of mainstream media on the public, of whatever, nation, and it's mostly the sort of Western developed world that I'm talking about, that they happen to have influence over. And I was, I remember reading a few years ago that the vast majority of media publications belong to a very small minority of individuals, and that many of them are part of large conglomerates. Even a local rag nowadays, like your local newspaper or whatever that gets popped through your letterbox, if that still actually happens where you are, on a daily basis, or whether you pop in by the newsagent and buy one, you'll find that these publications that you think are local and interested in you are also largely owned by corporate entities nowadays. So that ultimately a small number of people are in charge of the distribution of a massive amount of information to the public. And then, of course, there's another post on my blog which is called The Social Network Monster, where I talk about the influences of the social networks and censorship in the social networks. And I remember that I kind of began that post with an idea or a concept of where we thought that social networks, what they were supposed to do for us in the beginning, what we thought of it as, like a home from home online, where we could create communities of like minds and talk to each other about shared interests and that kind of thing. And it seems to have bastardized, if you pardon the expression, into a monster of its former glory, where now it's okay to say certain things that are approved of by the network, but if you say something that the network disagrees with, it's classed as misinformation or fake news, and you're given a slap on the wrist or barred or whatever punishment they feel like giving you. Yeah, I've on several occasions now had a slap on the wrist from either Facebook or Twitter, because I shared, what to them they might consider to be misinformation. But in my perspective, what I shared was factual information that's just an inconvenient truth from the perspective of these individuals that control these massive conglomerates. So you can kind of see where I'm coming from here with this. I'm worried, deeply worried about the level of censorship generally across the social networks, and I'm deeply worried as well about the far greater movement towards propaganda by the mainstream publications, the mainstream media, that we are all supposed to be able to trust to give us fair and impartial information. And of course, we do know, when I was growing up, I can remember being told, by different individuals who were looking after me at the time, at different times, don't trust the newspapers. You can't believe everything you read in the paper. It's all a load of rubbish. And I remember kind of taking that with a pinch of salt to a certain extent, but then I kind of remember looking at some of the more tabloid papers like the Sun and the Star and papers like that, which even many years ago, decades ago, were sharing information that was more inflammatory than anything else. It was designed to get readership. It wasn't necessarily designed to inform of you or I or anybody of information that we really needed to know or that would do us some good. It was designed to inflame our emotions and make us want to be taking an interest in it, and therefore keep buying the newspapers. And that seems to be the case today as well, is that the main publications are interested in what will sell. And unfortunately, because the nature of human nature, what sells a lot of the time is fear, and narratives that are kind of scaremongery and bad news. Bad news seems to sell, and always has seemed to sell, a lot faster than good news in the media. And it doesn't seem to matter how far back you go in this, there's always going to be that. Of course, in the old days, apart from the tabloids, you also got spreadsheet newspapers. You got, big, wide papers that you could hardly pick up. They would come folded up and through your letterbox, a fat bundle like this. And by the time you had it opened out, it was a big, massive thing like this, and you're reading it like this, and these newspapers, sometimes, people regarded them, they weren't tabloids, and they regarded them to have real news, whatever that meant at that time in it. But of course, that was also influenced by the feelings and narratives of the time by the people who run those media organisations. For example, with whatever political slant they happen to have. So we're kind of used to, including nowadays, thinking of perhaps the Telegraph in the UK of being, a more conservative focused newspaper, and the Guardian of being a more Labour/socialist focused newspaper. And so you had kind of newspapers that veered a little towards the right and newspapers that veered a little towards the left. And what happens is, because of that, you say to yourself, well, I know the papers are kind of lying, but it's all because they have a narrative. And really it's all, well, you see, there's these ones that are left wing and these ones that are right wing, and that's why the narrative there. But actually, that's not all that it is. It's not just about politics. Now, if you fall into the trap of thinking it's just all about politics, then you're going to end up basically believing whatever newspaper falls within the spectrum of what your politics are, whether you're a little bit left or you're a little bit right. But that's not necessarily the case. In fact, one of the ways that you can actually tell when you should really be concerned about what's being reported in mainstream media is when they're all agreed on it, regardless of politics. When every mainstream outlet is all saying the same thing and all beating the same drum, even though normally they would be fighting over different political opinions, and they would be selling their own narratives and selling papers based on their own perspectives and the editorials of their journalists and all the rest of it. Suddenly, all the newspapers and all the mainstream channels on television are all beating the same drum. That's when you worry the most. And when all the social networks are all beating the same drum and behaving in the same way, that's when you worry the most. And all the social networks right now are all heavily censoring information that they don't agree with. And we have to be absolutely clear about this, that this is not information that is fake news or wrong or somehow should not be shared, that they are censoring. It's just information that they disagree with. And the information that they disagree with is information that goes against a perceived mainstream establishment narrative on a particular subject. And that doesn't matter whether it's anything to do with a particular virus that we might have had to deal with, recently, or whether it has something to do with the ecology, the health of our planet that we survive on. Or whether it has something to do with sexuality, or gender, or anything like that, and one or two other topics, whatever, and actually in the UK, another topic that has been a bit of a bone of contention over the last few years, since 2016, I think it was it the Brexit vote, is the Brexit thing. And of course I spoke about some of that during the episode on polarity. Now, what's happening is that there is a particular mainstream narrative that is espousing from the political and mainstream media establishment, that they expect us all to follow, agree with, and share, and what have you. And as long as we agree with that and talk about that in that context and in agreement with their opinions and policies, then everything's okay. As soon as we say something goes against that, suddenly we're being censored for sharing misinformation or fake news. The problem with this is, who gets to decide what's true and what isn't? I mean, when I was growing up, I was told that politics, for example, was about different people having different perspectives and then getting to vote on them, and whoever wins gets into power, and that's what democracy is. But if you're not allowed to disagree, then how do you find out, how do you discern for yourself what's right and what's wrong from everything that you learn? So we're told that, because we're not experts, we should trust the experts. And it doesn't matter what it is we're talking about. That seems to be the current flow of establishment narrative, that we should trust experts. But experts disagree. Experts have been disagreeing for, centuries, millennia. Experts always disagree. Scientists always disagree. I can find science that agrees and disagrees with everything that happened in the last couple of years. Both agrees and disagrees. Of course, there's a mainstream narrative version of science that the mainstream political and media establishment want you to believe. And so therefore that's what they call science. But science is an argument. Science isn't set in stone. Not until we become gods ourselves. And it might be a little while before that happens. So as long as we don't know everything and we don't know exactly how all the universe works, then we are still subject to error. And we can still argue perspectives back and forth and decide for ourselves what we think about something. And that means we have to be allowed, in fact we are, because regardless of what the mainstream political narratives are, you always have free will. It's something they can never take from you. And you can always check different sources. Qualified sources, of course. I'm not suggesting raking through every conspiracy site going. Qualified sources, but checking every source. Checking a variety of sources. Checking sources that agree with the perspective you hear on mainstream, but also disagree with the perspective you hear on mainstream. Listening to different experts that have different points of view. But that's not what they want you to do. They want you to only listen to what they have to say. And that is the thing that's insidious. That is the thing that's dangerous. So this is where we are at the moment in the world. We have a mainstream media we have a political establishment, and we have a social network monster that is all beating to the same drum, whistling the same tune, and expecting us to believe it. And this is the biggest danger that you'll ever get, is when everybody who's normally always fighting with each other suddenly agrees on something. That's when you worry. Because what we're talking about then is dystopian nightmares potential. And I do realise it sounds a little bit inflammatory, a little bit scary. I do realise that a lot of people will think that, it's a little bit of an unnecessary triggering thing to suggest, that it might be way out there, that it's not realistic. But just look around you at what's been happening in the world for the last little while. In terms of the lockdowns, and you may disagree with me in some respects and think that they were justified to some degree, and it's perfectly okay to disagree with what I have to say. Tell me I'm talking rubbish if you like. There's comments abound around the internet here and elsewhere. Where, if you go to my website, you'll be able to tell me exactly what you think if you want. But what I think is that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And between the political establishment, not necessarily political parties, the deep state establishment, between that entity and between the mainstream media and the social networks, they've got it all tied up now to the point where they are completely controlling all information that's available, and we are just being fed brainwashing propaganda all the time. And that's what I mean by dystopian nightmarish scenario. You don't have to read 1984 or Animal Farm to realise that there's something wrong with all this. And you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to realise there's something wrong with all this. You just have to take a step back, sit down, in fact, and look at seriously some of what I've been saying over the last few episodes, including this one, about what's been going on in the world. And look where we are now with the polarity that I was talking about in the last episode. We really, and this, unfortunately, is also a tactic that is used, which is commonly known as divide and conquer. And what we have is a weird situation where everybody on the planet seems to know and fully understand the concept of divide and conquer, should I say. Everybody understands, more or less, most adult humans who have come across this information understand the concept of divide and conquer, and yet vast majority of human adults in the world right now are falling right into that divide and conquer trap, and are letting themselves be too busy fighting with each other, falling into that trap of being sucked up with that polarity and all the polarization in politics and media and all the rest. And are not looking around at who the real culprits are, who the people who are causing the problems in the first place. So those particular issues, that leads me into another conversation for another podcast at another time. Assuming that some of you have reached this point in this episode and decide to continue to follow me, which I hope you do. Even just to get a perspective, whether you agree with it or disagree with it. But one of the best things I think we can all do is listen to perspectives and opinions that we agree with, and also listen to perspectives and opinions we disagree with, so that we can arrive at our own balanced judgment about what's going on around us and in the world. And that's why I'm so strong on the idea of doing the very thing that the mainstream media try to rubbish, the very thing that used to be considered a virtue not so long ago and has suddenly become, according to the mainstream narrative, a sin. And that is that thing called doing your own research, finding things out for yourself, not just trusting automatically the narratives that you're fed. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. If you did, please share far and wide so others can benefit too, and download the podcast audio so you can listen again whenever you like, wherever you like. You can also subscribe to my channel, view and comment on all vodcast episodes by visiting lairdjohn.com. Thanks for listening to the vodcast of Laird John. I've been your host, John McVey.